A clear favourite and a team that looks like it might really burst out of the midfield are the headline takeaways from 3 days of Formula 1 pre-season testing in Bahrain. Inevitably, we don't have all the answers we'd like, but just like the teams, we have learned an awful lot from our time camped at the Sakhir circuit. From pecking order hints to unpicking some of the less representative runnings, here are 10 of our takeaways from testing. Red Bull had the best pre-season test possible. The car was quickest on short and long run pace, looked nailed to the track, and racked up a handy amount of mileage. This is very much an evolution of the all-conquering RB18. Red Bull has ruthlessly improved every aspect of the car, including the weight, to create a machine that builds on the phenomenal success of last year. Its pace advantage over Ferrari didn't look massive, but it was enough, doubly so on the long runs when Red Bull appeared to have a bigger edge on tyre management. All of this adds up to confirmation that Red Bull and Max Verstappen are every bit the pre-season favourites they were expected to be, with Verstappen not even trying to hide how happy he was with how much mileage the team got, how much it worked through, and how pleasant the car was to drive. Aston Martin is refusing to get carried away, but the fact is, in the paddock at the end of testing, everyone seemed to believe this team could be clear of the midfield and maybe even cause a bit of trouble for some of the big three. In Fernando Alonso's hands, the Aston Martin looked every bit as quick as Mercedes over a single lap, but even better over a race simulation. In fact, better tyre degradation made it look at least a match for Ferrari on long runs. Alonso's soft C4 lap wasn't good, but on the C3 he all but equalled Lewis Hamilton's best, and factor in the C3 to C4 1 second delta, he would have been with or ahead of Hamilton on times. From day 1 to the end of day 3, the AMR23 looked competitive on track in all conditions and on all tyre compounds. After Red Bull, Aston Martin left arguably the strongest impression of any team. Ferrari did little on track to set the Bahrain paddock alight, but it remained quietly confident in its car at the end of testing. Some low fuel laps earlier in the final day when the track was slower seemed to put Ferrari within about 2 tenths, but its long run pace was less impressive. Ferrari feels that this was a very productive test, with a lot of work done exploring the car's setup window and validating reliability. Some experiments didn't work, which is when the car looked least encouraging, but in the right window, Ferrari feels the car has the performance it needs. There are no dramatically different car traits, although Charles Leclerc said it's a bit better on the straights and a bit harder in the corners, a trade-off Ferrari has made to try to combat Red Bull's straight-line speed advantage from last year. There's always the tantalising expectation that at testing, especially on day 1, myriad innovative car tweaks will be revealed either thanks to being hidden previously or not on the car at all. But such revelations at this test were restricted to fairly subtle aero tweaks, which might be indicative of the phase that F1 teams have moved into with these cars in a stable set of rules. They've locked in their concepts, they understand them relatively well, and now it's all about incremental fine-tuning and the constant massaging of aero surfaces to optimise the airflow in every way. Cumulatively, there can be huge performance gains in all of those changes. But we also know that updates are coming. Alpine will have a visible one at the opening race, while Mercedes and McLaren have both teased significant ones in the coming weeks. Mercedes had a strange 3 days in Bahrain. It started solidly on Thursday, was all at sea on Friday, then turned things around on the final day to settle down into what seems to be an ambiguous place in the pecking order. The Mercedes doesn't look like a Red Bull beater, or at least not yet, but its grasp on third place is also in question. Though the progress made on the final day was significant, it was also inconclusive. Trackside engineering director Andrew Shovlin said the team ended in a better place and has understood where it needs to put its attention over the next few days. It's not perfect, but the drivers and the team are trying to look on the positive side, and the car at least doesn't have a porpoising problem. Things didn't look good for Alpine on paper at this test. It was slowest of the 10 teams, nearly 2.5 seconds off the pace, the only team to go slower than in last year's Bahrain test, and with the second least number of laps logged. There were a few problems, some of them ascribed to setup changes taking longer than expected thanks to a lack of familiarity with the new car, in particular the redesigned pushrod rear suspension. But team principal Otmar Szafnauer is quietly confident in common with the rest of the team, given the test went far better than those numbers suggested. It was holding back a lot of performance, most likely with a detuned engine, and on long run pace the Alpine looked far stronger, and of the traditional midfield group, only slower than Aston Martin. Both Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly were upbeat and spoke positively about the feeling of the car, and there's an upgrade planned for the opening race too. Third place on the overall timesheets flattered Alfa Romeo, but not by as much as you might assume. Given the team played a diminishing role in the upper midfield last season, it wasn't hotly tipped to start this year strongly, but testing went well. While there was a Ferrari power unit related problem that led to Valtteri Bottas stopping on track on the final day, the C43 logged 402 laps over the 3 days, which Bottas described as plenty. The fast corner instability troubles of last year have clearly been improved, and both Bottas and Zhou Guanyu confirmed that was the case. Bottas said there's no big limitations and the car's really nice to drive. While the Sauber Run team has a reputation for showing more of its hand than most in pre-season, Alfa Romeo heads into the Bahrain Grand Prix weekend as the midfield dark horse. This has not been a good test for McLaren, with a sense of deja vu from 12 months ago, limited running from a curious reliability problem and a car that looks troubled. Running repairs to the wheel brows cost it mileage on the final day and followed some time lost on Thursday to bodywork reinforcement as well. So the car is lacking track time relative to rivals and it continues to look vexing when it's running. Oscar Piastri's big spin early on the final day was a dramatic example of that, but it didn't exactly look like a midfield beater in Lando Norris's hands either. Unfortunately, McLaren's limitations are inherently linked to the launch specification of car that missed some of its development targets, and there's no update to fix that for at least a few more weeks. There were a few complaints before this test about 3 days not being enough, mainly from drivers, but by the end of this week, some people were left wondering if 3 days is actually too much in the current circumstances. Every single team completed at least one filming day prior to the start of testing, meaning they were able to put together significant mileage in Bahrain with minimal interruptions. The red flags were kept to a minimum and they were usually short stoppages for relatively minor problems. Mercedes' hydraulics failure fairly late on day 2 was the only time the offending car didn't reappear that day. Collectively, the teams managed 21,604 kilometres, which is almost 5,000 kilometres more than in 3 days of testing in Bahrain 1 year ago. The current packages are much better understood, and with power units that are carried over from last year, reliability is more of a given. Oh, and even though there are new floor height rules for this season to help combat porpoising, and the expectation was that it would knock car performance back by around half a second, the cars are already faster than last year. With no rule changes planned before 2026 and an engine freeze until then too, maybe F1 needs to consider reducing pre-season testing days even further for the next few years. It might help mix things up at the start of the season instead of letting everyone get so well sorted. Throughout the test, drivers have said that porpoising has not been a problem. Yet if you watch the coverage, you might be puzzled by this given the clear visual evidence that cars were at times porpoising. The key phrase here is at times. The porpoising phenomenon will not truly disappear while ground effect cars of this type are in existence. One of the tasks for teams during testing was to ensure they understood at what point porpoising was triggered so they could establish how best to run the car in terms of setup. So when saying porpoising is not a problem, it simply means it's nothing like the limitation it was last year. You can trigger it, but only if you stray too close to the limit of what's possible, and that's a limit that will change with track configuration, hence the need to fully understand when it might kick in. That's our run through of the biggest lessons from testing. If you want to delve deeper, how about checking out our video on what's wrong with McLaren's 2023 car and the impact that will have on the start of its season.